Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honour to rise tonight in adjournment proceedings to pursue a question that I originally asked on March 24th. It pertains to something that is fundamental to the concept that Canada has any framework of environmental law, any regimen of review in advance before large projects proceed. In a strange quirk of history, Mr. Speaker, I was actually in the Office of the Minister of Environment in the Mulroney administration when I shepherded through the Privy Council office permission to legislate the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. It finally passed into law. It was passed under the Mulroney administration, received royal assent under the administration of the Right Honourable Jean Chrétien, and it has evolved since then. It had as its cornerstone principles that the environmental assessment process must engage Canadians. Public participation and rights of public participation were fundamental to that act. So too were a broad understanding of what environment means, including the full environment, marine, terrestrial, all aspects of the environment, human health in the environment, and even socioeconomic impacts, even local community values. And that environmental assessment process required that alternatives be reviewed. You didn't just approve a project, you actually asked the question, is there a better way to do this that causes less environmental damage? All of that was destroyed completely in Omnibus Budget Bill C-38 in spring 2012. Those of us in opposition parties fought it as hard as we could. Liberals, New Democrats, Greens, the Bloc. We tried to protect the cornerstone of environmental law, and we lost, because might makes right, and the Conservative government at the time forced through the acceptance of something called the Canadian Environmental Act 2012. It is not an Environmental Assessment Act at all. It fails even in comparison to environmental assessments conducted by developing countries. It is a joke of an environmental assessment, and to make it worse, it took away the fundamental principle of public participation. That was a fundamental principle of our cornerstone of our environmental assessment law. It's gone. The new SIA 2012 says only those parties who are directly affected, like you live next door to a large quarry, you are next door to a large LNG facility. Only those people have a right to participate. It took away the heart and soul and rigor of environmental assessment law. But worse than that, in the case of energy projects, it made up a whole new regime. It said the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act doesn't apply through its normal agency operations if it's a pipeline, a nuclear facility, or an offshore oil and gas facility. In those cases, the National Energy Board, for the first time in Canadian history, was mandated to do environmental assessment. So too were the offshore petroleum boards for Newfoundland and Labrador, for Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. They were given the authority to do environmental assessments. Now, we've lived through quite a few of these, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt and without fear of contradiction from any person in the public interest or environmentalist who's gone through that process, they are a sham. Now, here we are. It's June 1st, 2016, and I ask the government opposite, why are we still operating under Bill C-38's destruction of our environmental law? I ask, as I did on March 24th, when can we see the end of C-38 and bring back real environmental assessment to Canada?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to address the question by the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands regarding the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Our government campaigned on a promise to conduct a comprehensive review of environmental assessment processes and to implement reforms that reflect an approach that is based on science, facts, and evidence. That is exactly what we intend to do. Mr. Speaker, we will work to ensure that this review and subsequent reforms are informed by consultation and partnerships with provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples. This has been our approach from the moment we took office and is central to restoring the legitimacy of the environmental assessment process that was lost under the previous government. Mr. Speaker, this government has already demonstrated the need to change the approach to environmental assessment implemented by the previous government. In January, we introduced 5 principles to guide our decision-making on all major resource projects under review. These principles ensure predictable, timely assessments based on science and data, that we account for the realities of climate change, and that we have meaningful engagement with communities and consultation with Indigenous peoples. These principles, along with a review of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, are part of the government's broad strategy to restore confidence in Canada's environmental assessment processes. While we undertake the broader review of environmental assessment processes, this government is ensuring that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency is adequately resourced to fulfill its responsibilities with respect to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 and the interim principles. As the member opposite notes, Budget 2016 provided funding to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency so that it does have the ability to deliver on its responsibilities. The funding announced in Budget 2016 will provide the agency with the resources it needs to undertake consultations with the public and Indigenous groups and will support compliance and enforcement. To the member opposite's question, Mr. Speaker, I will say this. The fact that 4 years of funding has been guaranteed to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency in no way implies that our government is not planning to undertake significant reform. As previously noted, this government intends to launch a broad review of environmental assessment processes later this year. I know that the honourable member opposite cares deeply about this issue, as do I, and that she has many thoughtful things to say regarding these matters. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the member opposite for the question, and we look forward to working with her as we work to reform Canada's environmental assessment processes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my friend from Northumberland, Peterborough, and it is my sad responsibility to tell her that what she has just read isn't true. All major projects do not fall under the interim measures. Only pipeline projects do. The advice given to the Minister of Environment, and I hold the Minister of Environment in the highest regard, but the advice from her officials, if that's where she got the bad advice, that it was sufficient to add a few conditions to pipeline projects, misses out entirely that the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012 puts entirely in the hands of offshore petroleum boards in Atlantic Canada the right to give permits for offshore drilling. And none of the interim measures apply to that because it only applies to projects under the National Energy Board. The extent to which Bill C-38 has destroyed our environmental assessment process is not fully understood by a new government. And I am hoping that new government will look at this and decide Bill C-38 must be removed much more quickly than current plans allow.
The Honourable Parliament Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has made it clear that the economy and the environment go hand in hand, and that is the only way we will get our resources to market. This budget sends a clear message that we are committed to restoring robust environmental assessments and ensuring that we do proper environmental assessment. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency was provided the funding to do just that. This commitment will be further met by reviewing environmental assessment processes and making the necessary changes to restore the public trust. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.